Why can't I get my ex out of my head involves understanding specific neurological mechanisms that maintain intrusive thoughts about past relationships, creating persistent mental loops that feel neurologically inescapable despite conscious effort to move forward. Your brain has developed specialized thought patterns and neural pathways around partnership that don't simply disappear when the relationship ends, requiring systematic understanding of cognitive persistence rather than emotional resistance. Understanding these thought persistence patterns helps transform overwhelming mental intrusion into a manageable cognitive process with clear biological mechanisms and evidence based strategies for rewiring your brain's attention patterns. First, the rumination default network maintains intrusive thought patterns through automatic brain activation. Jonathan Smallwood's default mode network research demonstrates that heartbreak activates the rumination default network, a brain system that maintains intrusive thought patterns about your ex. This activation creates persistent mental loops that operate independently of your conscious attention direction efforts, which explains why trying harder to stop thinking about them often backfires. The default mode network evolved for self-reflection and planning but becomes hijacked by relationship loss, creating repetitive thought patterns that feel like broken records playing endlessly in your mind. Second, memory consolidation processes maintain X-related associations that create intrusive thought triggers. Karim Nader's memory reconsolidation research shows that breakup triggers memory consolidation processes maintaining X-related associations. These processes create persistent thought intrusions as your brain attempts to integrate relationship loss into existing memory networks. Every time you experience something that was previously associated with your ex, like a restaurant you frequented together or a song you shared, your brain activates those memory circuits, creating intrusive thoughts as it tries to update these networks with the new reality that the relationship has ended. Third, dopamine expectation systems maintain anticipatory thinking that feels neurologically automatic. Wolfram Schultz's dopamine research reveals that relationships develop dopamine expectation systems anticipating partner interaction. Breakup maintains these systems, creating anticipatory thinking patterns that feel automatic rather than consciously chosen. Your brain learned to expect rewarding experiences when thinking about your ex, and these dopamine circuits don't immediately rewire just because the relationship ended. This creates persistent thoughts that feel pleasurable or hopeful even when you consciously know the relationship is over, explaining why thoughts persist despite logical understanding. Fourth, cognitive closure deficiency maintains unresolved thinking about relationship ending. Arie Kruglanski's cognitive closure research demonstrates that breakup creates cognitive closure deficiency, maintaining unresolved thinking. This deficiency creates persistent thought intrusion as your brain seeks resolution for fundamentally unresolvable relationship ending. Your brain evolved to seek answers and closure, and relationship endings often lack the clear explanations that would satisfy this cognitive need. This lack of closure drives repetitive thinking as your brain attempts to solve the unsolvable puzzle of why things ended, creating mental loops that feel compulsive and unproductive. Fifth, the suppression paradox increases intrusive thought frequency through ironic mental processes. Research from Daniel Wagner's ironic process theory shows that suppressing thoughts about your ex increases intrusive thought frequency by 40%. Understanding this paradox reduces efforts that inadvertently maintain thought persistence. When you actively try not to think about something, your brain creates a monitoring process that ironically keeps the thought active in your awareness. This explains why white-knuckling attempts to force yourself to stop thinking about your ex actually make the thoughts more frequent and intense, creating a frustrating cycle of effort and failure. Now, why managing persistent thoughts requires specific approaches rather than forcing yourself to move on. First, default network redirection through present moment awareness reduces rumination intensity effectively. Judson Brewer's mindfulness research demonstrates that redirecting the default network through present moment awareness reduces rumination intensity by 30%. This redirection creates neurological alternatives to persistent thought patterns about your ex. Instead of fighting thoughts directly, you create new mental habits where your brain finds present moment experiences more rewarding than rumination, gradually reducing the automatic pull toward X-related thinking. Second, memory reconsolidation through new experiences reduces association strength gradually. Elizabeth Phelps's memory research shows that reconsolidating memories through new experiences reduces X association strength by 25%. This reconsolidation creates neurological updating of relationship memories with current reality. When you deliberately create new experiences in contexts previously associated with your ex, you give your brain new memories to store in those neural pathways, gradually diluting the power of old associations and updating your brain's map of what those places and situations mean. Third, dopamine system recalibration through alternative rewards reduces anticipatory thinking. Nora Volkow's addiction research demonstrates that recalibrating dopamine system through alternative rewards reduces anticipatory thinking by 30%. This recalibration creates neurological alternatives to relationship-based dopamine expectations. By deliberately engaging in activities that provide authentic pleasure, accomplishment, or connection, you give your brain new sources of reward, gradually reducing the pull toward X-related anticipatory thinking as these new reward pathways strengthen. Fourth, cognitive closure creation through symbolic completion reduces unresolved thinking. Veronica Brandsider's goal research shows that creating cognitive closure through symbolic completion reduces unresolved thinking by 20%. This creation provides neurological resolution for relationship ending through symbolic rather than literal completion. When you write unsent letters, create art representing the relationship's end, or perform intentional rituals of release, you give your brain the symbolic resolution it craves, reducing the compulsive need to seek answers that don't exist and allowing your cognitive energy to focus on forward movement. Fifth, acceptance of persistent thoughts rather than fighting them paradoxically reduces their frequency. Research from acceptance-based therapies shows that allowing thoughts to exist without resistance reduces their power and frequency over time. When you stop treating persistent X thoughts as enemies to be defeated and instead view them as temporary neural habit patterns that will fade with consistent practice, you reduce the emotional reactivity that feeds their persistence. This acceptance-based approach differs from approval. You accept that thoughts currently exist while trusting that new neural pathways will eventually dominate. Sixth, there's actually a quiet, beautiful game built around this exact framework of observing your thought patterns, understanding their neurological basis, and systematically rewiring them. A 3D sanctuary called Inner Phoenix creates rooms for what you're observing about your persistent X thoughts, what you're feeling in your thought pattern process, what you need for support, and what you might try next for your thought change journey. It was made for exactly these moments when wondering why can't I get my X out of my head feels overwhelming and frustrating. But more on that soon. Let's continue with more evidence-based thought pattern change strategies. Seventh, professional guidance accelerates thought pattern change through targeted interventions. The American Psychological Association research shows that professional support specializing in intrusive thoughts accelerates thought pattern change by 35% through targeted interventions addressing default network redirection, memory, reconsolidation, and cognitive closure creation. Therapists trained in cognitive patterns understand how X thoughts persist and can provide specific strategies that general advice cannot offer. This specialized support acknowledges that persistent X thoughts involve unique cognitive processes deserving expert guidance, accelerating your capacity to rewire these patterns effectively. Eighth, your brain's thought pattern change capacity exceeds current persistence when provided with proper conditions. Michael Merzenek's neuroplasticity research demonstrates that the brain possesses extraordinary capacity to change thought patterns when given targeted support. Trusting this biological capacity reduces resistance to change process and prevents hopelessness about X thoughts. Your brain evolved sophisticated mechanisms for neural rewiring, and these systems activate when you provide consistent practice rather than inadvertently blocking them through frustration or forceful attempts to control thoughts directly. Ninth, time perspective development reduces present focused thought intensity by connecting with past and future. Philip Zimbardo's time perspective research shows that developing balanced time perspective reduces present-focused thought intensity by 25%. When you connect with past resilience by remembering times you've successfully redirected thoughts before and future hope by trusting that new patterns will dominate eventually, you create psychological buffer against current thought persistence. This temporal balance reduces the tunnel vision that makes X thoughts feel permanent and overwhelming right now. 10th, mindfulness practice specifically designed for thought observation reduces reactivity to persistent thinking. Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness research demonstrates that practicing mindfulness for thought observation creates distance between you and your thoughts, reducing the sense that you are your thoughts about your ex. This practice teaches you to notice thoughts arising and passing like weather patterns, reducing the emotional reactivity that gives them staying power. Rather than identifying with thoughts, you learn to observe them as temporary neural events, which naturally reduces their frequency and intensity over time. 11th, if this explanation of why can't I get my ex out of my head has helped you understand the neurological basis of persistent thoughts, I'd love to know which strategy feels most accessible for your situation. Give this video a thumbs up if it provided clarity about the mechanisms behind thought persistence, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss future deep dives into cognitive patterns and brain science. Your engagement helps others who are struggling with the same frustrating thought patterns find evidence-based understanding. Plus, your questions and experiences help me create more targeted content for real struggles people face. 12th, identifying and naming specific thought patterns reduces their automaticity. Research from metacognitive therapy shows that labeling thoughts reduces their power by activating prefrontal cortex oversight of automatic brain processes. When you can name specific patterns like, that's anticipatory thinking, or that's memory reactivation, or that's seeking closure, you shift from experiencing thoughts as overwhelming reality to observing them as understandable neurological patterns. This metacognitive awareness activates your brain's executive control networks, naturally reducing the automaticity of persistent X thoughts and giving you choice about engagement. 13th, creating competing thought habits through deliberate practice rewires brain circuitry gradually. Research from Charles Duhigg's habit loop studies shows that creating new cue routine reward patterns can replace old automatic thoughts with new habitual thinking. When you deliberately practice thinking specific replacement thoughts in contexts where X thoughts typically arise, you create new neural pathways that eventually dominate. This practice rewires the brain's response to triggers, making new thoughts automatic while reducing the frequency of persistent X thoughts through neural competition, where stronger pathways naturally suppress weaker ones. 14th, limiting exposure to cognitive triggers like social media stalking prevents reactivation. Research from Brian Primack's social media studies demonstrates that social media exposure to X content increases rumination by 60%. Strategic limitation of exposure to social media, mutual friends updates, and digital reminders prevents unnecessary reactivation of attachment circuits. This isn't about permanent avoidance, but about strategic timing, giving your brain space to weaken old pathways before re-exposure. As new pathways strengthen, you'll find X thoughts are less bothersome even when you encounter triggers, demonstrating strengthened neural resilience. 15th, practicing self-compassion for having persistent thoughts reduces secondary suffering that would otherwise compound the original problem. Kristen Neff's self-compassion research shows that treating yourself kindly for having X thoughts reduces their emotional impact by 20%. When you berate yourself for persistent thoughts, you create secondary suffering that amplifies the original distress. Self-compassion involves recognizing that persistent thoughts are normal brain processes. After attachment loss, treating yourself with kindness about this difficulty and recognizing that many people experience these same struggles, reducing isolation and shame that would otherwise maintain thought persistence. 16th, understanding that thought patterns reflect neural groove depth explains why persistence feels uncontrollable. Michael Merzenek's neuroplasticity work demonstrates that repeated thoughts deepen neural pathways like grooves in a record, making them default pathways. Your persistent X thoughts have created deeply grooved neural pathways through repetition during relationship and post-breakup rumination. Understanding that these grooves require consistent redirection to smooth out explains why change feels slow initially. This understanding normalizes the persistence timeline and reduces frustration that change isn't immediate, helping you persist with redirection practices long enough for new pathways to deepen. 17th, creating physical distance from trigger locations accelerates neural decoupling. Research from environmental psychology shows that changing physical environment reduces cue-triggered thinking by 30%. When you temporarily avoid places densely packed with X associations, you give your brain space to weaken those specific neural connections without constant reactivation. This isn't about permanent avoidance of your life, but strategic environmental change during active rewiring phase. As you build new associations, you'll be able to return to these places without experiencing intrusive thoughts, demonstrating successful neural decoupling. 18th, and hey, before you go, there's a 3D game called Inner Phoenix. You walk through it like a quiet temple with rooms for what you're observing about your persistent X thoughts, what you're feeling in your thought pattern process, what you need for support, and what you might try next for your thought change journey. It was made for exactly these moments when wondering why can't I get my X out of my head feels overwhelming and frustrating. No pressure. It's in the description below whenever you're ready. 19th, setting realistic timelines for thought pattern change prevents discouragement from unrealistic expectations. Research from behavior change studies shows that expecting immediate results leads to abandonment of practices before they can work. Thought pattern change typically requires 6 to 8 weeks of consistent practice before new pathways become default. Understanding this timeline helps you persist through initial weeks when change feels slow and frustrating. This realistic expectation prevents the common pattern of trying strategies for a few days, seeing limited results, and abandoning the approach before it has time to create neural pathway changes. 20th. Tracking thought pattern progress provides motivation and awareness of change that might otherwise go unnoticed. Research from monitoring studies shows that tracking progress increases persistence and awareness of gradual changes. When you note daily whether intrusive thoughts decreased, whether you successfully redirected, or whether emotional intensity lessened, you build evidence that change is occurring even when it feels invisible. This tracking provides motivation to continue practices during periods when change feels stalled and helps you identify which strategies are most effective for your specific thought patterns. 21st, celebrating small successes in thought redirection builds momentum and confidence. Research from behavior modification shows that reinforcing small successes increases overall success rates significantly. When you notice even brief moments when X thoughts were less intrusive or when you successfully redirected attention, celebrating these moments reinforces the neural pathways you're building. This positive reinforcement accelerates learning by making the new pattern more rewarding, creating positive feedback loops that strengthen new pathways faster than simple repetition alone, building confidence that change is possible. 22nd, understanding that relapse is normal prevents abandonment of strategies after setbacks. Research from habit formation shows that developing new patterns includes setbacks that are part of learning, not failure. When X thoughts return intensely after a period of improvement, this reflects normal neural pattern competition rather than permanent failure. Understanding that setbacks are expected parts of neural rewiring prevents the discouragement that leads many people to abandon helpful strategies, recognizing that persistence through setbacks eventually leads to stable new patterns. 23rd, combining multiple thought pattern change strategies creates synergistic effects, accelerating overall progress. Research from complex intervention studies demonstrates that combining cognitive, behavioral, and mindfulness approaches creates greater change than single strategy approaches. When you practice mindfulness observation and thought labeling and competing habits and acceptance simultaneously, these strategies support and enhance each other. This multifaceted approach addresses persistent X thoughts from multiple neurological angles, creating faster and more comprehensive pattern change than relying on any single approach alone. 24th,
Your commitment to understanding the neuroscience behind persistent thoughts demonstrates your brain's natural capacity for curiosity and learning. This capacity serves you well in healing.
Research from Neuroeducation shows that understanding mechanisms behind experiences increases sense of control and reduces helplessness. When you understand that X thoughts reflect understandable brain processes rather than personal weakness or failure to move on, you gain agency in the change process. This knowledge-based approach to healing engages your brain's natural learning systems, making you an active participant rather than passive victim of thought patterns. 25th, trusting that your brain will eventually develop new default pathways reduces effortful fighting with current patterns. Trust is a key element in neuroplasticity-based healing. Research from Expectancy Studies shows that believing in eventual success increases persistence and eventual positive outcomes. When you believe that consistent practice will eventually create new thought patterns that dominate X thoughts, even when current evidence seems contrary, you maintain practices long enough for neural changes to consolidate. This trust-based approach prevents the common pattern of abandoning strategies during difficult periods when change feels impossible. 26. Your brain's capacity for attentional control increases with consistent practice. Research from attention training studies demonstrates that regular attention redirection practice strengthens prefrontal cortex control over default mode network activity. When you consistently practice redirecting attention away from X thoughts toward chosen focuses, you strengthen the neural circuits responsible for attentional control. This increased capacity eventually allows you to effortlessly shift attention when X thoughts arise, making them fleeting rather than persistent experiences. The practice itself rewires brain architecture toward greater self-directed attention. 27th, creating physical reminders of new patterns supports cognitive change until neural pathways become automatic. Research from environmental cue studies shows that external reminders bridge the gap between intention and habit formation. Placing visual cues in your environment that remind you of new thought patterns, boundary setting, or redirection strategies provides external support while internal pathways strengthen. These cues create scaffolding that holds new patterns in place until they become automatic, supporting neural change during the vulnerable period when new pathways are still weak and easily forgotten. 28th, reducing overall life stress while working on thought patterns accelerates progress by freeing up cognitive resources. Research from cognitive load theory demonstrates that stress reduction increases cognitive capacity for change efforts. When you reduce other life stressors during intense thought pattern work, you free up limited cognitive resources needed for attention redirection, habit formation, and emotional regulation. This stress reduction acts as an accelerator for thought pattern change by ensuring your brain has adequate resources for the demanding work of neural rewiring, rather than being depleted by multiple simultaneous challenges. 29th, understanding that thought pattern change is an active process requiring energy prevents passive waiting that maintains old patterns. Research from action brain studies demonstrates that active engagement changes neural patterns while passive waiting maintains them. Thought patterns about your ex will not fade on their own. They require active practices that redirect attention, build new pathways, and consistently choose new responses. Understanding this active nature prevents the common pattern of waiting for time to solve the problem while inadvertently reinforcing old patterns through repeated activation. Your brain needs new experiences, not just time, to create new patterns. 30th, your persistent X thoughts don't reflect personal failure or weak character, but rather demonstrate your brain's capacity for deep attachment and learning. These same neural mechanisms that currently cause suffering were essential for forming the deep bonds that made your relationship meaningful. Understanding that X thoughts reflect successful attachment learning rather than pathology reframes these thoughts as side effects of your brain's relational capacity. This reframing reduces shame and provides compassionate context for the work of rewiring, honoring that your brain's strength for bonding is simply being redirected now that the relationship context has changed.